Israel here at the center. So everybody's been watching lately the corona crisis, of course, because we are all personally affected by it rather greatly. And everybody's also worried about the issue of North Korea and what's happening there, given that it's a nuclear power, and instability could be a very dangerous transitional period. But as well, though Corona is obviously taking up all the news cycle has actually been very crowded. And one of the major events of the last few weeks has been essentially the collapse of oil prices. At one point, dipping below zero, where actually carriers had to pay to have their gas or their oil taken off the tankers. So really an event none of us thought we'd live through. It's not entirely an unprecedented, or well, it is unprecedented, but it's not entirely an unexpected event given where things were going the last few weeks. But it is a very unusual event. Oil has recovered a bit, but not anywhere near where it used to be. So we'll be discussing all that today with Kevin, who's really one of the top experts on this. The background slightly is that essentially there was already a fairly low oil price over the last period before the Corona crisis. Obviously, with decreased demand, there was also pressures downward on oil. But then Saudi Arabia and Russia failed to come to an agreement to cap their production and therefore cap price collapse. And in the process of that, the price of oil collapsed quite considerably, compounded by the fact that the reduction of use, the reduction of demand was quite severe over the last month or two because of the Corona crisis. So whereas many people look at it and scratch their heads and say, why did Saudi Arabia and Russia not come to an agreement? I mean, it's almost suicidal on their part. Why is it that they even got in such a price war? Here today is Kevin. Kevin, you followed this, and I think you see it quite differently. So why don't you tell us, to start with, the background to why you think Russia and Saudi Arabia weren't as bothered as we think they would be by such a collapse in prices?
Well, the reality of it is that, David, and thank you for the introduction, I believe we're in a global economic war. I believe we've been in a global economic war for more than 20 years, but it is really ramping up right now. And energy, particularly oil, has been at the center of every war that we've had over the last 100 years. Oil was a big part of World War II, for example. When Germany had difficulty getting access to energy, it slowed their advance and really made a difference in the war. It started World War II when we put an oil embargo on the Japanese, and that really created the basis. And right now, the same thing is happening. Oil and energy are a part of the war. And right now, Russia and China are upset. Russia and Saudi are upset because the swing producer of the world's largest oil producer until very recently, has been the United States of America. Our shale industry, our fracking industry has changed the world market for energy in a really positive way. It's something that Vladimir Putin has opposed. We now have WikiLeaks and other proof that Putin has funded environmental groups in the United States and in Europe to stop fracking because he wants traditional oil and gas. Russia is a low-cost producer. Saudi Arabia is a low-cost producer. And when we began the fracking movement in a big way and became the swing producer, the Saudis decided, and this is 2014, and there's a lot of data on this, Saudis decided, why don't we just stop cutting back our production to keep prices high? They'd been doing that for years. Saudi was the swing producer. So when oil prices got too low, they would cut back their production. And when they did that, the price would come back and all of OPEC benefited. Well, now America comes in, not subject to any OPEC guidelines. And all of a sudden we're producing. If prices get low, we just kept producing. And so the Saudis said, this is ridiculous. We keep cutting back. We've got to maintain our market share. And in order to maintain our market share, we're going to actually produce even at low prices and drive prices down, because the American shale producer needs 30, 40, or $50 a barrel, and we can produce oil out of the ground for 10 or less. So starting in 2014, they took a different approach. Russia joined them at times, opposes them at times, but Russia clearly wants to see higher long-term oil prices, and to get there, they feel they have to drive the American shale producer out of business.
Is there a precedent of using oil in such a way to undercut a major producer or his economy, the way that Saudi Arabia and Russia may be doing right now? Has it happened in the last 50 years?
Well, let's go back even a little further. This is what John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil were accused of, that they would produce oil below their cost of production, and they make it available to drive competitors out of business. Now, I've studied the history. I wasn't alive when Rockefeller was doing it or not doing it. I have good friends on both sides of that debate, but the reality of it, it's in the literature as a legitimate means of driving out competitors. And it happens in other markets. The Chinese have done it. We have laws against dumping, everything else. The difference is the global oil markets we put up with for a long time, cartel. I mean, normally you don't want to have a cartel, but we just acknowledge OPEC's a cartel, and we as American policy have accepted that in exchange, really, that they would continue to trade oil in dollars. So it is something that happened during the Nixon administration, and it's continued on. The American shale producer busts that cartel, and they don't like it.
Got it. Have we ever done that? I mean, other than the Rockefeller scenario, have we done that recently? Did we in the Cold War try to do this with oil at one point?
Yes, absolutely. Russia, the Soviet Union depended highly on hydrocarbon revenues. And the Soviet Union, we did a multi-pronged approach, as you know. It's economic warfare. We got the Pope involved. We got the Saudis involved. We got Margaret Thatcher involved. We drove down the price of oil with the Saudis' help. It literally bankrupted the Soviet Union. They couldn't keep up on defense spending as we ramped up defense spending, and it brought about the end of the Cold War. It was a master stroke. And I have no doubt that the Saudis and the Russians are attempting to reverse that, maybe in collaboration, maybe just separately with similar goals. But I have no doubt that they see that needs to reverse here.
Wow. So today, oil trade, it's up a little bit, but it's what, about $29, $30 a barrel for WTI, Brent. I mean, no, sorry, I think Brent's around 29. Brent's around 22. WTI is let's see, now I got it right here, 16. So it was 29% up, but still that's way below the number you gave us, which was 30 something for shale production here and so forth. So how is this affecting our industry? I mean, is our industry able to survive this? Or are you seeing things to suggest that no, actually this is having the desired from the point of view of Russia and Saudi Arabia, but that this is having a desired impact on our oil sector, much to our national interests threat, frankly?
Well, I have bad news. I have good news. I have bad news. And we did a program, Economic War Room with Kevin Freeman. We release every Thursday on BlazeTV. And we did a program with Troy Andrews, who is the CEO of Paradigm Midstream. And Paradigm Midstream did the longest bore in history to help get oil from the North Dakota fields to market in basically in the Gulf. And so the pipeline connected into the Dakota Access Pipeline and so forth. Brilliant guy, a great show. You need to see it. But the bad news is this is going to bankrupt a lot of players in the shale industry. There's no question about it. You can't produce oil. They've hedged some, and those that are hedged can hang on longer. But there's bad news associated with that too, is that the airlines are the ones that bought the hedges, and the airlines are in trouble. The airlines that bought oil in the future to be delivered at high prices. So, that's not a great salvation, but it'll keep them alive a little longer. That's the bad news. Good news for America, not for the specific shale producers, is that the assets remain in the ground. The equipment remains present. The pipelines are there. We can fire back up the shale industry when we need if prices get high. That's the good news. Now, the bad news on the other side is this comes at a time when American financial networks, banks and investors and so forth are massively pulling away from investing in hydrocarbons. There's this ESG movement, environmental social governance, where they are literally divesting fossil fuels. And as a result of that, $12 trillion of financing has been pulled away from the energy industry. So will anyone invest in energy again? This is something that Putin is just loving, because if the ESG movement, which he's funded a lot of the environmental movement, if the ESG movement succeeds in getting Americans to walk away from funding hydrocarbons, and we cannot transition rapidly enough off of oil, natural gas, et cetera, what will happen is the Saudis and the Russians will be back in control. Prices will spike high. I mean, we were at $147.50 a barrel just 12 years ago. 147.50. Right now, the oil price below zero, you mentioned, we are literally seeing the lowest oil prices in the history of the world.
Yeah, you mentioned to me a few days ago that it's equivalent to less than what it was 160 years ago.
Right.
That's an astonishing comparison in real terms. Now, one thing that I have noticed, though, is, do you think Saudi Arabia and Russia anticipated the impact of the COVID crisis enough, or are they in some trouble too, do you think?
Well, the Saudis are definitely facing trouble. MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, has tried to move away from hydrocarbons as the engine of growth for Saudi Arabia. That's why they did the IPO of Saudi Aramco. They're desperate for cash. The needs of maintaining the monarchy are severe. I mean, Saudi is the world's lowest cost producer, but they actually need more dollars per barrel average to meet their regular fiscal needs. And so they're hurting. They've got enough reserve to last months or years, but they do not have an in perpetuity financial stream unless prices get up. So they are actually more vulnerable than the Russians. Russia could get by with maybe $50 a barrel oil, and they've got reserves to last several years. So Russia has a little more staying power in this, but in the long run, neither of those can survive a very low oil price without a collapse of their economy. The United States of America can survive a very low price. We just don't want to go and be vulnerable to OPEC's whims or Russia's whims again. That's why we need a dynamic shale industry here.
Yeah, no, I fully understand that. Yeah, Saudi Arabia, I've heard variable levels to which they would need to have oil to pay essentially for the sustaining of their government based heavily on payouts. Their economy is still well over 80% dependent on hydrocarbons. So I've heard figures between 80 and 110 for maintaining the Saudi government. So that's clearly a big pressure. It's also an issue, from what I can see, in some other countries in the region that we don't think of as major oil producers, aren't necessarily major oil producers, but their economies were geared, or they were vectoring towards some sort of an economic transformation based on reviving or bringing online their hydrocarbons industry. One country, for example, that I've been following was Egypt. And Egypt's economy right now is really not in very good shape. It has not managed to successfully transition from essentially a military industry, not defense industry, where the military actually owns most industry and economic forces inside the country. They've been trying to transition away from that. But a lot of the economic rehabilitation of the country was essentially anchored to the expectation, in their case, more natural gas than oil, Zuhair field and other fields that are yet to be discovered would come online and come online soon. And they will come online to feed Egypt's domestic needs, but they won't come online probably effectively as they thought to generate the revenues they would need for their economy. So I think that there's a potential for a substantial economic crisis in some of the lesser producers like Egypt. Iran obviously expects, hopefully, for itself to come online at some point in the next few years. In our case, we would wish that only happens after a transition of the government to something much more productive and much more, much less of a terrorist nation. And as a result, we would like to wait on that. But still, nevertheless, there is an expectation down line that they come online. So obviously they will have a problem too. I've heard also different numbers for what Iran needs oil to be to sustain itself, and it's not nowhere near that either. So I do see a lot of crises in various countries emerging from this. Where are the Europeans in this? Have you been following how Europe? I mean, obviously they're mostly consumers, but there are, and I suspect that Norway and so forth have being produced. Norway's a producer. They probably have a pretty substantial fund to weather this. But do you see a major impact on European, both as a consumer and as a producer of oil, coming out of this?
Well, first, let me share regarding Egypt. I was there 2 or 3 summers ago. I spent a good amount of time with the government, and we talked through economic warfare and all the things that were going on. And they are dependent on energy, and frankly, they get support from the Saudis and others that financially that helps them. And so, if there's an oil crisis, it's going to hurt Egypt. There's no doubt. And in regard to Iran, I actually did. I was the economic warfare author of the chapter in this directed study of Iran that was presented to the SecDef. And we looked at the cost, what did Iran need in oil price, and it was well north of $100 a barrel for them to be successful. Now that was on the heels of where oil had hit $150 a barrel, so they were riding high for a period. They're hurting now, but there's no doubt their need fiscally is much greater than even Saudis need. So they're hurting. This low oil price is crushing the Iranians. It's beneficial to the Chinese, large importers. But your question was on Europe. Europe benefits with lower energy prices, and Europe is also subject to being co-opted by the Middle East and by Russia and by China. The European elites tend to listen to all of these adversaries, frenemies of the United States. And so there are a lot of competitive voices about what's good for Europe because they are funded in large part by these other parties, whether it's the Saudis or the Russians or the Chinese. So you get disparate voices from Europe, but they largely benefit because they are, other than Norway, they are not large energy producers. Germany talks about pipelines with Russia and so forth. So Russia is conflicted also, just like American policymakers.
Yes, I would imagine they would be. It's you mentioned about Egypt, the payout to Egypt. It's quite true. Right now, Egypt does expect in a certain period of time to get some revenue or some substantial revenue from its hydrocarbon sector. But for the moment, the gap between what it needs to survive, and we're talking very rudimentary survival, and what it actually has is filled by the Saudis. One could also look at a country like Jordan and see a similar situation where they're really very dependent at the moment on payouts. And their economy is already in crisis, as Egypt's economy is in crisis, but Jordan's economy is even graver crisis. Libya is another case where it's really counting on the oil sector to rehabilitate itself. And we see already that it's in a big civil war, and it's not really able to resolve it. it's a whole different subject about what Turkey may be doing there and so forth. But nevertheless, it's a very difficult situation in Libya right now, and the oil sector is already suffering because of it. So we see those secondary impacts of this clearly. Europe, one of the things I'm thinking of was the same thing that we see with when Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez just jumped in joy when she heard that oil prices went down, thinking, oh, this is going to put the evil oil companies out of business. So it was sort of a gut reaction on her part. And as consumers, Europe also would love to see lower oil prices. But at the same time, in terms of the larger effort to transition to these, either the Green New Deal, which Ocasio-Cortez keeps peddling, and many of the environmental movements in Europe, doesn't this damage or at least delay substantially the viability of alternative sources of energy coming online as well?
There's absolutely no question. It's hard enough. You can take a 16-ounce bottle of water and fill it with gasoline, and you can move a multi-thousand-pound vehicle miles down the road. It is a very compact, powerful source of energy. Gasoline is amazing at what you can do. And then you think, what does the green movement offer? And you can, great batteries that Tesla's made, you can move a multi-thousand-pound vehicle quite a distance using that, but you still have to get the energy from somewhere. And it is generally produced by hydrocarbons somewhere. Lower prices of gasoline means who's going to buy an electric car? Who's going to pay the premium to have an electric car? And the same is true for moving our electric utility industry and really any other industry. Low energy prices from fossil fuels are one of the worst things that can happen to the Green New Deal, green movement, because on a comparative basis, there's just no reasonable way to justify the excess you would have to pay if you can get gasoline for $1 something a gallon.
Yeah, no, exactly. So I think that that's one of the secondary AOC will begin to realize at a certain point it's not as good a thing as she thought originally. Now, let's look down line a little bit. So the American economy begins to restart. Surely we've taken a hit, but one can count on very substantial industrial production coming back online, hopefully within a few weeks, months most. Europe too, and China coming back online as well, although that's a whole separate issue of whether or not this whole crisis hasn't had and will have a much graver impact on China over the long term. But so it comes back online. How do you see this playing out? I mean, you've mentioned the sort of structural threats that American industry faces through some of the money being pulled out, the investments being pulled out, and so forth. Going down line, do you see oil prices ever recovering quite to a level of $50, $60, $70 a barrel? Or is that age behind us? Or is it actually sort of a wave where right now it's gone down so far that it will dry up, as you said, investment and therefore future exploration, E&P activities and so forth, and therefore in a year or two or three, suddenly wells that we were expecting to be coming online won't be coming online, and there might even be a shortage. How do you see all this playing out over the next year or two in that sense?
Well, I'd look a little beyond a year or two, but the reality is clear that oil prices, energy prices have the potential to be substantially higher than they have been this year and higher than they were last year. We're consuming, if the economy grows again, we're consuming and increasing our consumption at a rate that is greater than the ability to produce new energy. And so in the short term, I see low prices. In the medium term, I see the potential for higher prices. At least that's what I've seen some of the information that the Saudis and the Russians are looking at. In the very long term, I do believe that technology will surpass just using gasoline and oil. In the very long term, we may be able to change the demand curve in such a way that prices come down again. But that medium term is what I'm concerned about. I don't believe that the Saudis and the Russians are taking the pain now with the expectation that they will never get higher prices. I believe they're absolutely certain they will get higher prices. And in the medium term, I think it may be more than a year or 2 years. I'm also concerned about the budget deficit of the United States and the fact that we're going to need a lot of foreign buying of our debt. And the oil ties into that because we have had the petrodollar since Kissinger and Nixon, where the Saudis, when they get excess revenues, they're not going to have excess revenues for a while, so they won't be reinvesting in U.S. Treasuries. Price of oil is down, so that's another reason that no one will be investing in U.S. Treasuries, at least in the oil patch. And so we're going to have to find ways to fund our debt, which is growing more rapidly than it's ever grown. It's back to World War II growth levels relative to our economy. What that means is that there's the potential. We're on the razor's edge. We're going to slip either one direction, which would take us to deflation, and a lot of people are afraid of deflation, and the other side is inflation. If we tip to the inflation side, oil prices will not only get to the $50, $60 a barrel, but they will exceed it and they will go well past it. And keep in mind, because oil is a financial asset, people trade it, and they trade it sometimes irrationally. So in June of 2008, in the summer of 2008, as we were entering that, busting the housing bubble, entering the deepest recession that we'd experienced since the Great Depression, the worst economic times we've seen since the Great Depression until now, but we know what the cause of it is here. What we saw oil go to $147.50 a barrel on the futures market. People were trading it. If people start trading this asset again, and when it goes to an absolute low as it has, it can also go to a peak. There is entirely the possibility to see $200 a barrel of oil. And, Goldman Sachs might disagree with that today, but they said that it very clearly 10 years ago, they said that's what would happen. And it's still a possibility to happen now. And if it happens at $200 a barrel and we have no shale industry, there's nothing we can do to stop it.
How long would it take to bring the shale industry back online? I mean, I know if it opened tomorrow, there's assets that are still in place and so on and so forth. But it's not quite like an oil field. An oil field, it's not so easy to get right back online. If an oil field shuts down, you have water seeping and all sorts of things going. You need actually to do re-engineering work to bring it back online. How would shale be different in that way? Is it a switch thing, or do you need to reinvest if it's been fallow for a little bit?
It is not just a switch thing. It's actually quite a chore to get a shale play restarted. And so you want to do everything you can to not stop production. You want to keep it active. And that is a national security thing that we could consider as means to just provide life support for the industry to continue to maintain the wells. You don't want to shut down a well. It's very expensive to shut it down. It's very expensive to restart it. At least I'm not the oil expert, but that's what Troy Andrews shared with us. We got to make sure that the pipelines stay in place. We got to make sure that we don't, because prices are down, we don't ignore the refineries and the refining capacity. We can't sell our assets to foreigners. I mean, the Saudis have been in trying to buy our refinery assets. The Venezuelans have owned a lot of our refinery assets, and the Russians have tried to buy them from Venezuela. So we have to do everything that we can to recognize this is a national security infrastructure industry, and we've got to maintain it, at least its ability to come back. And maybe, the president tried to open the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to take more oil in, which would make sense. And now he's fighting to make that excess capacity that we have available as storage, because one of the problems we have is the storage facilities around the world are very full. And so you pump the extra oil, where do you put it? That's why they're paying people to take it off our hands. We ought to be storing as much cheap oil as possible right now, because that also helps us blunt any effort by the Saudis or the Russians downstream to drive prices higher.
Yeah. And of course, one is to maintain production on some level so that the wells still stay active, but also to make sure that the companies that are involved don't go under. We have seen I saw Diamond Drilling, for example, is announcing bankruptcy. Have you seen the beginning of that wave already, where actual companies are going? Something we wouldn't have imagined a year or two ago, but real oil companies going under. Have you seen a wave of that beginning, or is diamond drilling and a few others just one-off for the moment? That would really be something that could only kick in if this continued for another half year or so.
No, the companies are on the edge. Diamond Offshore is a tragic loss. Whiting and others are on the edge. They're trying to renegotiate. They're attempting to use all the programs that are made available by the government. The reality of it is that they need much higher, substantially higher oil prices. The good news is a lot of them hedged, and those hedges will last for a period. Bad news is they sold a lot of those hedges to airlines who can't afford this, and airlines are looking to find ways to get out of those hedges so that they don't have to take delivery of jet fuel that they can't store, that they don't need. So it is a crisis that continues. The only answer is to get our economy restarted as quickly as possible, and then to go in and clean up where there is long-term damage. And the way to do that, and on Economic War Room on our show, we put out a data tool produced by Navigo, who are friends of mine that are patriotic engineers. The data tool says how we could restart the economy on a county by county basis. You can go in certain counties, more people will die of suicide than will have risk from COVID-19. And we put that tool to the White House. We put it everywhere we can, because right now we could be restarting our economy on a county by county basis. And a lot of these areas that could use the energy will be out and using it. And that would help save not only our energy producers, which is the show we release tomorrow, but today the Economic War Room show special that we're putting out is the American farm industry, which is also under fire from COVID-19. So restarting the economy, you can see the tool. Everybody can look at the tool at restartnow.io and go play with the tool. It's not funded by government. It's not funded by big data. It's funded by crowdfunding, Indiegogo, like a GoFundMe page. And they can look at it. They can look at their county and see if their county would be better open or shut. And that is, I believe, the right answer to solving the oil crisis here.
So I have a question. We've talked about oil. Is the situation with natural gas fundamentally different?
You know, natural gas prices have held up a little better. They still have storage problems, storage capacity issues. We flare off a lot of natural gas. We send it off into the atmosphere or burn it because we can't store all of it. It is harder to ship and transport and so forth. You have to liquefy it to ship it overseas and so forth. But natural gas prices have held up a little better. They've not gotten the financial market attacks, I think. And you know, natural gas is equally important to the economy. It has other uses that that oil doesn't have. We use natural gas in certain fertilizers. We use natural gas in a lot of processes. So it is facing some of the same challenges. We are the world's largest reserve nation for natural gas. I believe that's still true. And you know, it's an important part, and it's cleaner burning. It has helped reduce carbon emissions by having power plants transition from coal to natural gas. So it is a strategic part of our energy economy.
Yeah, it also is a huge assistance in some of the production, being able to get. We've seen already a fairly substantial transformation of the economy over the last decade because of the cheapness of natural gas and the declining natural gas prices that already were over the last few years. For example, the steel industry has become much more efficient because it uses natural gas where it didn't before. And I do notice that natural gas actually did hold a better price. It did fall today, so it's not quite the rebound that oil is today, but these are momentary things. So natural gas is clearly something else that I think we need to think about. By the way, when we talked about Egypt, for example, their future is really natural gas. It's not oil. And on some level, Iran's might be natural gas too, if it ever came back online. Certainly Israel, it's all natural gas. There's no oil at this point. It may be oil under the gas, but there's nothing beyond natural gas at the moment. So some critical allies are also depending on natural gas. It also struck me, by the way, that the dogmatic insistence on zero carbon footprint really, really in an environmental sense was damaging more than it was helping, because it prevented countries from switching over some of their power plants to natural gas, which leaves a very little footprint. Still is a hydrocarbon. It leaves a little bit of a footprint, but it really, from an environmental perspective, it was a great step forward, and they were essentially shooting themselves in the foot doing that. So I have a couple questions here. One was from Frank Cerrone, which was, could we give away natural gas to Europe to keep Russia from getting hard currency? So in other words, could we use an industrial policy in terms of giving away or subsidizing gas as well to sort of get through this and keep positively distort the economy away from where it could go in Europe if the Russians could wade in and use this moment otherwise?
That's an interesting idea. We don't have the pipeline to ship it there, so you liquefy it. You know, one comment I want to make on natural gas is that, isn't it ironic that we pull out of the Paris Climate Change Accord, and yet we're the nation that has reduced carbon emissions the most? And the reason is because we've accepted and adopted the use of natural gas, just like you said, David.
Yeah.
So natural gas is a clean burning, good fuel. We produce lots of it. We have lots of it to produce. That's a positive. Could we give it free to the Europeans? I don't know how. I don't know that that's good trade policy. It's an interesting idea. I wouldn't know how we could do it, but certainly we need to have an option for Europe to get American natural gas, liquefied or otherwise, because this is a geopolitical war. It's an economic war, and we've got to be prepared to respond. So I wouldn't take that off the table. I just don't know how we would pull it off.
It would have to involve some sort of a U.S. cover, because there are some alternative sources they could look at with the Zuhair field, for example, in Egypt, is large enough that it could make a real substantial contribution to European gas consumption. Israel's, it could make somewhat of a contribution, a modest one. If they discover more, it could be a different question. The problem with Egypt and Israel is they're looking over their shoulder, and they're looking at the issue of Russia. And they know that that's the one red line Russia will draw vis-a-vis Israel and Egypt, Egypt being a bit more dependent on Russia over the last decade than Israel has. But even Israel, having experienced the Obama years and was very nervous about the American relationship, isn't eager to pick a big fight with Russia. So those aren't really there. The one thing about Europe, a huge vulnerability as well, is how much of their gas comes from Algeria. It comes from various places, but there's a convergence point in Algeria where all the pipelines come into and then go out of. And so you may have 4 different pipelines going to Europe from North Africa, but all of them actually originate in the same place in Algeria. And it's a substantial portion of European gas comes from there. It's nowhere near where Russia's imports to Europe are, but it's enough that it could cause serious trouble in Europe. So I think it's worth noticing. And again, we were talking about some of the other producers being affected by the low prices. Algeria is another country where its political circumstances are quite questionable in the short and medium term, frankly long term too. And the failure of certain prices to keep afloat some of their economic demands is clearly a big problem. So that I'd watch as well. Let's turn to a few other questions here. Let's see now. Question from the audience as well. Will gas producing countries be forced to break from I think he said, break from monoproduct economies as the reliance on the single commodity falls with fracking and the rise of US dominance in the field, along with the fall in demand that for them is cataclysmic and from which it is anybody's guess whether they can ever recover. Do you want to field that?
Well, there's no question that the Saudis see the handwriting on the wall. They know they can't be solely hydrocarbon producers. They've invested somewhat in trying to diversify. They've not been successful yet, but they know the handwriting's there. They're going to have to move away. The oil, hydrocarbon, fossil fuel business doesn't have a 200-year projection. It may not even have a 50-year or 20-year projection. So they have to, and I don't know if I were Iran, I don't know what I would be doing. If they're smart, they would be making up with the world, apologizing for the things that they've done to the world, and trying to be a good player in the world, because there are bright Persian people there, but they're not going to get the oil revenues long term that their economy seems to require.
Yeah, I mean, related to that, it's you partly answered it, but with respect to Iran, do you think this drop of oil prices, will cause internal Iranian conservative government to collapse in the mid or short term? I'll let you answer that first, then I'll answer it too.
Well, I would defer to you to answer that. I mean, what we did in this directed study of Iran said that ultimately it's economics that would cause the change in regime that was necessary for the people to enjoy the freedom that we want them to have, and for the world to see that menaces removed. But let me turn it to a true expert.
No, I think you probably have as many insights as I would at any rate. Iran, I think you'd have to look at it in a couple levels. One is obviously from a traditional governance point of view, the Iranian government cannot survive without oil revenue, and it clearly is in stress. And yet they survive. And not only do they survive, but they ensure every last penny of their resources go toward either the Houthis in Yemen or Hezbollah in Lebanon, or to prop up the Syrian regime. Essentially, they seem to see that their regional strategy is as vital an asset to survival for them as is actually the raw money they need to keep their own country functioning in any real capacity. We see a great deal of stress there economically. We see a great deal of resistance there economically and politically, and yet they still put the money into those other areas. So that's one area. Then you'd say, yeah, but at some point this catches up with them. I mean, at some point you just can't make it up anymore. Money runs out, money runs out. They need to pay a lot of people a lot of money all the time to keep this structure afloat. And their economy is still also somewhere in the range of 80% in one way or another, dependent on the hydrocarbon sector. So this is not something they can fudge. But then you get into the deeper mentality of the government. And what I'm worried about is, yes, there are those in the government, probably Rouhani, who are arguing, listen, this is so dangerous. Let's use the corona crisis to say, listen, world, we need help. We're willing to accept your help economically. Just that economic assistance has to come in the form of lifting sanctions. And sort of play on the West's sense of fairness and guilt and so forth to try to get the sanctions lifted. It's very interesting when we offer them in-kind assistance. When we tell them, listen, we'll send you doctors, we'll send you medical equipment. Oh, no, we don't want any help like that. We want you to lift the sanctions. So it's very clear they want fungible money. They don't want actual assistance on COVID. But there are many in the West who, whether they just don't get it or whether they're willingly not seeing it or whatever, there are many who will fall into that. What's interesting is that there's a whole other crowd in the Iranian government which is resisting this. And their basic view is that this is a sign. One has to understand they're really, it's a government of faith. On when you're dealing with Khamenei, or you were dealing with Soleimani, who is no longer with us, but his successor and so forth, you're dealing with people who are genuine believers, and their belief, not necessarily the belief of Rouhani or even Khomeini, the original ruler in Iran, but certainly Khamenei and the IRGC crowd there, is they believe that in sort of an apocalyptic moment approaching, that the Mahdi is going to return. And I'm seeing a considerable amount of discussion that this collapse of oil prices and the stress this is causing is a sign from God to get serious about showing your faith. So you could actually see the exact opposite as to what we would expect from the Iranian government, namely a retrenchment and increasingly aggressive behavior to provoke this cataclysmic confrontation, which they ideologically and theologically truly believe in. Wow. And we do see some of that behavior begin. I mean, they are true when they sent some of those little boats around our ships last week. They approached us in a way that was careful. It wasn't threatening the way you would expect such an attack or a quasi attack to take place. So therefore, they kind of knew we weren't going to shoot on them. And yesterday in another webinar, Shoshana Bryan from another institute, the Jewish Policy Institute, noted also that they broadcast from those little boats that there was an Ayatollah on board one of them, showing that he's resisting. And of course, an Ayatollah wouldn't put himself in danger like that. So it was clear they did it in a way not to get shot at. But if we've looked at their behavior over the last year, they have not been de-escalating all the time. They've been pushing right up to the edge, and often over the edge, shooting missiles at us, hoping that they will kill our soldiers and our bases and so forth. So I think there is some strong debate in Iran between sort of the apocalyptic crowd and those who believe in the Islamic Revolution's preservation as critical at this point. And I'm not sure how it'll play out, but the more desperate the government becomes, the more you may see, I mean, it's a horrible analogy, but sort of the Hail Mary pass type option of some conflagration. So Iran is a very difficult thing to read. By the way, as far as the people are concerned, for them, it's all a question of what the will is of the rest of the world. If they see the world backing off, then they're not going to kill themselves when they think that the world is going to save the Iranian regime by lifting sanctions or so forth. So they're really a factor that is influenced by the behavior of the rest, rather than what will at this moment explode and overthrow the government. So next question. I'm not quite sure what it was referring to. It said, didn't the Japanese employ this tactic with aluminum? Given when it was, I think the question was probably, do you understand what the question was referring to, Kevin?
Well, I know that there was a time in which the Japanese employed with steel and the steel industry where they were dumping, and I think that that marks 1220, where you undercut your competitors in price. And they did do that, and the American steel industry was bloated and not very efficient, and they took advantage of that. And there's no question that it's happened to industry after industry. The Chinese do it all the time, where they've underpriced in pharmaceuticals and other manufacturing. So yes, the tactic has been used by Japan. It's been which was operating a mercantilist style economy back in the 80s and 90s. And it's been used by the Chinese since then to undercut American production by dumping. And so I think that's the answer to that question.
Okay. One thing that I had 2 or 3 questions in various forms on: how well do you think the Trump administration is versed on this? Where do you think they are? How much do they understand about the dangers that you were talking about to our industry in the long run, in terms of mobilizing some sort of an industrial policy to address the threat that this poses? how confident are you that the administration is on top of this, that the people who are dealing with it get it, and that they're going to be able to manage this?
Well, I'm more comfortable with the Trump administration by far than the Obama administration. Although in the very early days when the president was elected, I thought, here's an opportunity to talk about what I've been shouting about for 10 years, that we're in a global economic war. And in the White House was Steve Bannon. And Steve was the person I was talking to I was in Bannon's war room just before I joined this call today. The reality of it is because of the nature of the American political system, there's so many voices shouting in the room. A few of them are fully understand the problem and what we're dealing with, and a few of them are fully prepared to get the president's ear and draw attention and focus the resources that we need. But there are still some that don't believe that there's any connection between economics and geopolitics. They tend to believe that national security and economic policy are not interrelated. They want them to be separated like they were during the Clinton years. And they believe in free trade under all purposes. And because of that, unfortunately, there are some very loud voices, some very good people I like very much, conservative economic political thinkers that are ignoring the reality of global economic war. And they're just now beginning to wake up with the COVID crisis. I mean, I was told over and over and over, why would China hurt us? China's our friend. China would never do anything to harm us. And I was told to sit down and shut up because I was messing with global free trade. Now, I think the American people are strong enough, and I think the evidence is strong enough that at least the honest policy wonks in that direction are listening. And I remember going to AEI, and I spoke at AEI with Kevin Hassett, who was on the economics floor, and then there was the national security side of it, and Ambassador Bolton was on that side. And I remember they would see each other at cocktail parties, but they didn't interact like they should. They didn't talk regularly like they should. And I remember going to Kevin Hassett and saying, this is a global economic war. And it was about a 4-hour debate. He brought in the top economists, the people I've respected my entire life. And we went, me and my friend David Hemingway sat there and went on 12, and people would come in and go out and come in and go out. And finally, we started to break through when I got across the idea that not everybody has an economic motive for everything. Sometimes they have a different motive, and that was hard for an economist to accept. Except I said, maybe they have a different time horizon. And the light went on, because Osama bin Laden was worth $300 million. He was richer than Boone Pickens, in the late 90s. And yet he was willing to die with a €100 note pinned to him and basically broke. Why was he willing to do it? Well, he had a time horizon of eternity. He saw what was going to happen to him over the eternal perspective from his view, what he thought eternity was. And so he was willing to sacrifice his personal economics. And I got Hassett to see it. And Kevin, to his credit, wrote me back an email and said, no, you convinced us all. And he even wrote a cover note for my book, Secret Weapon. And now he's the head of the Council on Economic Advisors. So there are good people. I had dinner with Larry Kudlow last year. Frank Gaffney got me a dinner invitation. It was a small group. And I got to talk to Larry Kudlow, and Larry Kudlow got it. Peter Navarro gets it. There are a number of people in the administration that are power players that now understand this, and we're beginning to make progress. So I'm very happy from that perspective that this horrible pandemic and all of the troubles we've had with China are at least waking up some of the elite, the really smart people that are honest, that love America, they're patriotic, and they're in the Trump administration. So we can feel good about things like that happening. As
an economist, I think, and by the way, I didn't mention in your introduction, you are both an economist by academic training, but also, unlike many of us, you actually lived in the real world, and you actually were in the financial world for quite a while. So you have quite an experience with this, and I thought it's a very important insight what you're saying about that economists often have, and it's not only economists, have this overwhelming faith in the rationality of economics being the determinant factor, having dealt with the Middle East for many, many years, I cannot emphasize how virtually everybody believes that economic determinism or economic factors will drive politics. And yet I have never, ever seen almost any decision in the Middle East made by the Arab world that follows economic interests closely. I remember having this discussion with an Israeli official 10 years ago, and I was telling them that with Mubarak and being a little unstable and so forth, as well as some of the political pressures he's facing, they could well cut off the gas trade to Israel. At that point, Israel had not found its own natural gas. It was still completely dependent on Egyptian natural gas as part of the peace treaty. And the Israeli officials said, too many Egyptian officials get money from this. This is so fundamental to the Egyptian government. There is no way they would cut it off. And 2 years later, it was cut off. And I've seen this again and again and again. And I think in Washington as a whole, there's this proclivity to believing economic determinism or economic factors determine politics. And I'm glad that you remind us that there are other timelines, horizons, as well as other factors that can influence in that. Kevin, do you want to give us any last thoughts? We're coming up on the hour, so I want to give you a chance to say any last thoughts that you want.
Yeah, three things that we've done in the Economic War Room show recently. One of them is 7 steps to restart the economy now, and that's essential. And we talk about sheltering the truly vulnerable. We talk about a data-driven approach to restarting the economy. And why is that important? Well, it's the second order effects. One of them is the one we've talked about here, is we're crushing the American energy industry. And that's a vital national security interest we need to protect. And the second one, the one that's just released, is with Mitzi Perdue, whose husband was Frank Perdue. Frank was the chicken king, Frank Perdue farms chicken. And her father was the founder of the Sheraton hotel chain. And she's a brilliant woman in her own right. She was the past president of the Ag Women's Association. We are crushing the American farmer. And the geopolitical impact of that is so severe because we think, well, shelter in place, what would it hurt to wait another 2 weeks and keep our economy shut down for another 2 weeks? It might save some lives here. You know what? It's going to cost lives in Africa and Asia and other parts of the world dependent on the American farmer. And so we have a tribute to the American farmer. And we talk, Mike Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, said, it doesn't take any gray matter to be a farmer. You poke a hole in the ground, you drop a seed in it, put some dirt on it, drop some. He has no idea that the American farmer is one of the most astute business persons in the world. They have to forecast things. They have to do supply and demand charts. They have to study input costs. They have to decide what we're planting this season. How are we going to deliver it to market? Where's it going to be produced? They have very sophisticated supply chains, and they've all been smashed. So if you don't go to restaurants, the farmers that produce only for restaurants are getting nothing. So they're euthanizing animals, livestock. Right now, we're losing food. And they're deciding, instead of planting sweet corn that people like to eat, we're going to plant feed corn that will be served to animals because I can put it in the barn and I can leave it there for a year and sell it a year from now. Guess what? The butterfly effect of that means we're going to be killing people in Africa already suffering under a severe drought, already suffering under locust plague. And now you add the pandemic. The third thing is plague. This will cause people to die. So if you're a bleeding heart liberal who's sitting in your mansion in San Francisco eating ice cream, I have news for you. You're not saving an extra life by keeping the economy shut for another 2 weeks. You're costing 100 or 1,000 lives for every one that you might save here. So here's my message. Go watch Economic War Room with Kevin Freeman, and we'll do that restart now, county by county. If we get enough people to demand that, and it's not funded by government, it's not funded by big data, it's funded by patriotic engineers who wrote that program. There's an Indiegogo campaign. You can pay donate $9 and help get your state all the data to see which counties we open now. If we follow this plan, we can save the farmer, we can save the American oil industry, and we can really save lots of lives around the world.
Kevin, thank you. I want to let our listeners know that we do have this program. It'll be online, and you can rewatch it at your convenience. Moreover, we have these webinars roughly every week, and you can go online and see the schedule of what we're going to do. So our audience should definitely join us again and again, and enjoy this program again and again if they want. Kevin, I want to thank you in particular for raising some issues that none of us were really thinking about from the start, about what the real backstory is to what this price war could imply, all the way to the current, where as a conservative we're talking about needing to construct some sort of an industrial policy, which is anathema to what we usually want. But in this case, it is important. So again, I thank you, Kevin. I invite all our listeners and the audience to join us next week on the next program, as well as to come and use this program as much as they can. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, David.